Microsoft announced, with what sounded like genuine humility, that it was removing Copilot from Windows. It was the kind of moment that companies almost never deliver, an apparent admission that they went too far, that they pushed something on you that you never asked for, and that they were course correcting. Tech journalists wrote about it. Windows forums celebrated. Users who had spent years fighting off unwanted AI buttons in Notepad and intrusive pulsing icons on their taskbar felt, for a brief moment, like they had actually been heard. There was just one problem. Microsoft was not removing Copilot. It was renaming it, hiding it behind neutral language, stripping the logo off the button and calling the whole thing a retreat. The AI features are still there. The data collection is still there. The surveillance architecture is still there. They just stopped calling it Copilot. And that distinction between removing something and rebranding it so it looks removed is exactly the kind of corporate dishonesty that technology users have every right to be furious about. Today, we are going to tell you the full story of what Microsoft actually did to your Windows experience, what they told you they were undoing, and why the difference between those two things matters far more than any press release is going to admit. To understand what is happening now, you need to understand how aggressively Microsoft forced Copilot into every corner of your digital life over the past few years. This was not a gradual, thoughtful rollout of a feature that users had requested. This was a blitz. Microsoft put Copilot in Windows. Then they put it in the taskbar by default. Then they put it in File Explorer. Then they put it in Notepad. Then they put it in Paint. Then they put it in the snipping tool. Then they put it in Photos. Then they put it in Edge. Then they put it in Widgets. Then they renamed Office 365 to Microsoft 365 Copilot. Then they launched physical keyboards with a dedicated Copilot key, the first new key added to the standard PC keyboard layout in decades, specifically designed to open the Copilot pane whether you wanted it or not. The strategy had a name inside the company, though not one they advertised publicly. It was called putting Copilot everywhere. A high-ranking Microsoft executive in leaked internal comments that made their way to reporters described most of the consumer-facing Copilot tools as gimmicky. Not helpful, not transformative, gimmicky. And yet the rollout continued because the AI arms race with Google and Apple demanded it, and because the enterprise market was writing billion-dollar checks for Copilot and corporate productivity software. And Microsoft wanted to make the consumer version feel inevitable and already adopted, even though almost nobody was choosing it voluntarily. The technical consequences of this strategy were severe. Throughout 2025, Windows 11 went through what reviewers described as one of its worst development years in living: memory. Security updates broke business computers and left them unable to boot. File Explorer slowed down noticeably. Dark mode elements stopped rendering correctly. Microsoft was simultaneously trying to build a stable operating system and cram an AI layer on top of every part of it, and the result was an operating system that felt increasingly unstable, increasingly cluttered, and increasingly like a product that existed to serve Microsoft's commercial interests, rather than the people actually using it. The word that kept appearing in user forums and in technology coverage was enshittification, a term that became widely used to describe platforms that start by serving users, then pivot to serving advertisers or shareholders at the user's expense. Windows 11 in 2025 became one of the clearest examples of that pattern in the entire software industry. The worst single moment in this entire saga was not a Copilot button in Notepad. It was something called Windows Recall. And the story of Recall tells you more about Microsoft's actual relationship with your privacy than any number of marketing statements about trustworthy AI. Recall was announced in May 2024 as one of the flagship features of a new category Microsoft was calling Copilot plus PCs. The pitch was that Recall would act as a photographic memory for your computer. It would take screenshots of your screen every few seconds, store them locally on your device, analyze them with AI, and then let you search your entire history of everything you had ever seen or done on your computer. Microsoft framed this as a productivity revolution. If you saw something weeks ago and cannot find it now, you could just search your memory and find it instantly. Security researchers took about 48 hours to identify the actual horror of what this feature represented. The initial version of Recall stored all of those screenshots in an unencrypted plain text database that sat openly on your computer. Not encrypted, not protected behind authentication. Just sitting there, readable by anyone or anything that could access your file system. A researcher named Alexander Haganah built a tool he called Total Recall within days of getting access to the feature. Total Recall could dump the entire contents of your Recall database instantly. Every screenshot, every piece of personal information visible on your screen during any moment that Recall was running. Financial records, medical information, private messages, passwords that appeared on screen even briefly, all of it sitting in plain text accessible to any piece of malware that happened to be running on your machine. The press reaction was immediate and devastating. Recall was called a privacy nightmare. It was called spyware. Security professionals said it amounted to building a surveillance apparatus into the operating system itself. Microsoft was forced to delay the feature's launch, which had been planned for June 2024, and then delay it again after a beta version released in October 2024 was still found to have inadequate protections. The feature was pulled a second time in November 2024 for further revisions. Recall eventually returned in 2025, this time as opt-in rather than opt-in by default, with encryption added and Windows Hello authentication required to access the stored data. Microsoft presented these changes as responsive to user feedback, as evidence that the company takes privacy seriously and adjusts when problems are identified. What was less discussed was what the existence of the original version revealed about how Microsoft had approached the design in the first place. A feature that takes screenshots of your screen every few seconds and stores them in an unencrypted plain text database was not a feature where encryption was accidentally forgotten. It was a feature where privacy was not the starting point of the design. The original recall told users something important about how Microsoft was thinking about them as data sources to be captured rather than as people to be protected. The fix came because of public outrage, not because of a company culture that prioritized user privacy from the beginning. And even with the revisions, Recall's story was not finished. In March 2026, the same researcher who had originally exposed the unencrypted database published a successor tool called Total Recall Reloaded. It performed essentially the same function that Microsoft had claimed its security improvements would prevent. The architectural problem with a feature designed to record your entire screen history is not solved by adding encryption. The encryption protects the stored data from some attack vectors. It does not change the fundamental nature of what the feature does, which is build a comprehensive, searchable record of everything you have ever seen or done on your computer. That record exists as a target. Any attacker who can authenticate as you, or who can find a way around the authentication, gets access to a database that contains, in the words of one security researcher, the entirety of your working life. Gaming Copilot brought a separate scandal that arrived in late 2025. Microsoft had integrated an AI feature into the Xbox Game Bar that was taking screenshots during gaming sessions. Users who discovered this were understandably angry. Privacy advocates pointed out that this was exactly the same pattern that had made Recall so controversial. Microsoft was capturing visual data from user sessions through an AI feature that many users did not fully understand was running. The company defended the feature and described it as designed with privacy in mind. What made users angrier than the feature itself was the removal process. Because Gaming Copilot was deeply integrated into the Xbox Game Bar, turning it off or removing it required running PowerShell commands with administrator privileges to uninstall the entire Game Bar application. There was no simple setting, no obvious off switch, no one-click disable. A feature that users had not opted into required technical expertise to remove. That design choice, making a feature easy to acquire and difficult to remove, is not an accident. It is a choice. Now let us get to what Microsoft announced in early 2026 and what actually happened. In January 2026, internal sources told technology journalists that Microsoft was planning to scale back its Copilot push significantly. The company was said to be removing Copilot from apps like Notepad and Paint, removing the default taskbar icon, and generally becoming more intentional about where AI showed up in Windows. The announcement generated considerable goodwill. Users who had been complaining about Copilot saturation for years felt that their feedback had finally landed. Tech coverage was largely positive. The framing was of a company that had listened, learned, and adjusted. Then the actual changes started rolling out, and people looked more carefully at what was actually different. In Notepad, the Copilot logo was gone. The button in the toolbar that had said Copilot was replaced with a pen icon. When you hovered over the pen icon, it said Writing Tools. The features that had existed under Copilot branding were entirely intact. You could still generate text using Microsoft's AI model. You could still rewrite your content, change its tone, adjust its format, and do everything that Copilot in Notepad had offered. The only thing that changed was the name and the logo. The AI was still there. It was just not wearing the Copilot badge anymore. Microsoft described this internally as removing unnecessary Copilot entry points. What it actually did was take the label off the door without closing the door. The Copilot key on newer keyboards, which had been specifically designed to open the Copilot pane, was scheduled to be remapped to launch something called an assist menu instead. Not removed, remapped. The physical hardware that Microsoft had shipped to millions of PC users as a dedicated Copilot input was being pointed at a differently named destination. The underlying function of pressing that key to get AI assistance remained. Pavan Davaluri, Microsoft's Executive Vice President of Windows and Devices, described the company's approach as becoming more intentional about where Copilot appears. He did not describe removing AI from Windows. He described renaming it and repositioning it. The difference between those two things is everything. The European Commission had opened a Digital Markets Act investigation in early 2026 into whether Microsoft's Copilot integration in Windows and Edge amounted to anti-competitive product tying. The removal of the Copilot branding in consumer apps, while keeping the underlying features, was precisely calibrated to respond to that regulatory pressure. By making Copilot opt-in in appearance while keeping it active in function, Microsoft could argue to regulators that users were not being forced to use AI features. Whether that argument would satisfy the Commission remained to be seen, but the timing of the retreat from visible Copilot branding, coinciding exactly with the opening of a regulatory investigation, was not a coincidence. What Microsoft told you was that it heard your feedback, that it was removing Copilot from places where it did not belong, and that it was being more respectful of user choice going forward. What Microsoft actually did was strip the Copilot brand from features that continued to function identically, rename surveillance-adjacent features like recall with more neutral language, and redesign the visual presentation of AI in Windows without redesigning the underlying infrastructure or the data practices that had generated so much legitimate concern. The AI is still in your Notepad. It is still in your snipping tool. Windows Recall is still available on Copilot Plus PCs, still building that searchable record of your screen history, still representing the same fundamental privacy architecture that security researchers called a nightmare when it was first announced. The difference is that now it comes in a less provocative package. This pattern of announcing a retreat that is actually a rebrand is a technique that technology companies have used repeatedly, and it works because most users do not have the time or the technical knowledge to dig into what a change actually means versus what it was announced to mean. Microsoft is betting that the goodwill generated by removing the word Copilot from Notepad will be enough to quiet the user frustration while the underlying AI integration continues to deepen and the data collection continues to operate. That bet is not unreasonable. Corporate history is full of examples where a cosmetic change diffused a real controversy, but it is worth being clear about what is happening, because the gap between what was promised and what was delivered tells you something important about how Microsoft thinks about the people who use its products. The people running Windows on their computers deserve straight answers about what their operating system is doing. They deserve features that are truly optional and truly removable without administrator-level technical commands. They deserve privacy architecture that starts with their protection as the design goal rather than adding encryption as a patch after public outrage forces the issue. And they deserve companies that, when they announce a change, mean that change actually changes something, rather than using language that creates the impression of a retreat while the infrastructure keeps running exactly as before. Microsoft told you it was removing Copilot. What it removed was the name. That is not the same thing, and you were right to want better than that. There is a broader lesson in the Copilot story that extends well beyond Microsoft, and it is one that applies to every piece of software you use every day. The technology industry has developed a sophisticated vocabulary for making things that serve corporate interests sound like things that serve user interests. Features that collect your data are called intelligent personalization. Features that track your behavior are called contextual assistance. Features that are difficult to remove are called deeply integrated experiences. The language is designed not to explain what a product does, but to neutralize your instinct to question it. When Microsoft described its Copilot rollout as making Windows more capable, it was using that exact language. When it described the rollback as being more intentional, it was using that same language again. Intentional sounds like restraint. In practice, it meant keeping all the same features and removing the brand name. The recall situation is the most important thing to understand in this entire story, because it shows you not just what Microsoft was willing to do, but how it thought about the people using its products. A feature that takes screenshots of your screen every few seconds and stores them in an unencrypted database was not designed by people who were thinking first about your privacy. It was designed by people who were thinking first about a product capability and treating your privacy as a problem to address if the public noticed. The public noticed, loudly, and Microsoft adjusted. But the adjustment came from external pressure, not from internal values. That distinction matters enormously when you are deciding how much to trust a company with the data that flows through your computer every single day. The corporate behavior that Microsoft demonstrated throughout the Copilot era also illustrates why user resistance to these forced integrations is not paranoia or technophobia. It is a rational response to a company that had repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to put its commercial interests ahead of user preferences. Microsoft added a Copilot key to keyboards before most users had decided they wanted Copilot. It embedded Copilot in apps that users opened daily before checking whether those users wanted AI assistance with their text documents. It launched a screen recording feature as opt-in by default before confirming that the data it was capturing would actually be secure. Each of these choices reflected a company that was moving fast to capture an AI narrative and treating user consent as an afterthought. The eventual scaling back of the Copilot branding changed the visual experience of these decisions without reversing the underlying dynamic. What would an honest retreat actually look like? It would involve making recall genuinely and easily removable, not just opt-in. It would involve giving users a single, clearly accessible setting to turn off all AI features across Windows without requiring PowerShell commands or administrator privileges. It would involve being transparent about what data the remaining AI features collect and where it goes in plain language rather than buried terms of service. It would involve not renaming Copilot in Notepad to Writing Tools and then presenting the rename as removing Copilot from Notepad. It would involve treating the people who use Windows as adults who deserve accurate information about what their software does, rather than as an audience to be managed with carefully calibrated messaging. Microsoft has the technical capability to deliver all of that. The question is whether the commercial pressure to keep AI features active and data flowing will ever allow the company to prioritize what its users actually want over what its shareholders are expecting from the AI bet. Based on everything that happened between 2024 and 2026, the evidence suggests the answer is no, not unless something forces them to change. Pay attention the next time a major technology company announces it is removing something you did not ask for. Read past the headline. Look at what is actually being changed versus what is being renamed. Ask whether the function is gone or just the label. Because in the space between those two things, between what companies say they are doing and what they are actually doing, you will find the answer to the only question that really matters. Who does this software actually work for? Think about the specific moment when Microsoft shipped physical keyboards with a dedicated Copilot key. This decision was made at the highest levels of the company. It was not an accidental feature or a minor UI choice. It was a hardware commitment, a physical manufacturing decision, a statement that Copilot was so central to the future of Windows that it deserved permanent space on every keyboard sold going forward. Millions of keyboards were produced and shipped with that key. Millions of users received devices where a physical button on the hardware they owned was wired to open an AI assistant they had never requested. When Microsoft later announced it would be remapping that key to an assist menu rather than Copilot directly, it did not announce a recall of those keyboards. It did not announce that the key was being removed from future hardware. It announced that the destination of the key would be reconfigured. The physical presence of the AI prompt on your keyboard was not going anywhere. The key remained. The doorbell still rang. They just rerouted which room it rang in. This level of commitment to AI integration at the hardware level, at the operating system level, at the individual application level, tells you something about the scale of the commercial bet Microsoft has made and why a genuine removal of these features was never on the table. Microsoft told investors repeatedly that Copilot and AI integration in Windows represented the company's future. Enterprise customers were already paying significant money for Copilot features in productivity software. Satya Nadella had announced publicly that 20 to 30% of the code Microsoft was writing was being generated by AI. Walking back the consumer Copilot push was never going to mean walking back the strategic commitment to AI as the foundation of Microsoft's product line. The consumer-facing retreat was a surface-level adjustment designed to manage the public relations damage while the enterprise AI business kept scaling. The Copilot you could not see in Notepad anymore was still running underneath. Microsoft just stopped reminding you it was there.